From penthouse to pavement, but a cat wouldn't let him give up. The view from the 42nd floor had once been Declan's kingdom. Every morning he'd stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his glass penthouse, watching Manhattan wake up beneath him like a glittering circuit board coming to life. The city had pulsed with possibility then, each light representing another deal, another opportunity, another step higher up the ladder he'd been climbing since his first day on Wall Street 15 years ago. Now, sitting on the frozen concrete of East 14th Street at 2 in the morning, Declan could barely make out those same lights through the haze of his own failure. The December wind cut through his once pristine suit, the same Armani he'd worn to close a $12 million acquisition just 6 months ago. The fabric hung loose now, wrinkled and stained, a monument to how quickly everything could unravel. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd always prided himself on being the guy who saw the angles others missed, who calculated risk down to the decimal point. Declan Morrison doesn't lose, he used to tell his reflection in the marble bathroom of his penthouse. Declan Morrison makes things happen. But the market had humbled him with surgical precision. A series of cryptocurrency investments that looked brilliant on paper had evaporated overnight when regulations shifted. His hedge fund partners had scattered like roaches when the lights came on, taking their capital and their connections with them. The penthouse went first, then the car, then the savings. Pride had kept him from reaching out to family. His sister in Oregon, who'd warned him about getting too comfortable. His mother in Florida, who'd never understood his world anyway. The shelter on 23rd Street had a strict policy: no pets. Declan had learned that 3 hours ago when he'd finally swallowed enough pride to walk through their doors. Not that he had a pet. He'd never been the type. Too busy, too focused, too important for the mess and commitment of another living thing depending on him. His stomach cramped with hunger, a sensation that still felt foreign after months of 5-star restaurants and catered boardroom meetings. The soup kitchen wouldn't open until morning, and even then the line would be long and the portions small. He'd discovered this brutal arithmetic of survival over the past few weeks, sleeping in doorways and counting quarters like he'd once counted millions. A sound cut through his spiral of self-pity, a short, insistent meow that seemed to come from behind the overflowing dumpster across the narrow alley. Declan looked up, expecting to see nothing more than shadows and urban debris. Instead, 2 amber eyes stared back at him from the darkness, unblinking and oddly intense. The cat that emerged was lean but not starving, with dark grey fur marked by distinctive white patches around its muzzle and chest. It moved with the confident grace of a creature that knew exactly what it wanted, picking its way carefully over broken glass and discarded food containers until it stood directly in front of Declan. "Get lost," Declan muttered, too exhausted for even basic kindness. "Nothing for you here." But the cat didn't move. Instead, it sat down, wrapped its tail around its front paws and continued staring. There was something unsettling about that gaze, not the casual interest of a scavenging animal, but the focused attention of a creature making a decision. The standoff lasted several minutes. Declan found himself studying the cat despite his irritation. It was clearly a stray, but not one of the feral, skittish creatures he'd glimpsed in other alleys. This one had an air of dignity, of purpose. When it finally moved, it was with deliberate intention, walking directly to Declan and pressing its small head against his soaked pant leg. The contact was warm and unexpected. For a moment, Declan felt something other than the numbness that had carried him through the worst days. The cat's fur was surprisingly soft despite its rough living conditions, and there was a subtle vibration. Purring, he realized with surprise. "Kestrel," he said suddenly, the name appearing in his mind without conscious thought. It felt right somehow, this precise, swift word for this precise, swift creature that had appeared at his lowest moment. The cat, Kestrel, looked up at him with what seemed almost like approval. Then, in a gesture that would become achingly familiar, it placed one paw on Declan's shoe and tapped 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was unmistakable, deliberate. "What are you doing?" Declan asked, but Kestrel had already settled against his leg, a warm weight that somehow made the concrete feel less cold and the night less endless. For the first time in weeks, Declan found himself talking aloud. Not the bitter mutterings of self-recrimination he'd grown accustomed to, but actual conversation. "I used to live up there," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the glowing towers in the distance. "Corner office, mahogany desk, assistant who knew my coffee order better than I did. Funny how none of that matters when the bottom falls out. Kestrel's purr deepened, a sound that seemed to resonate in Declan's chest. The cat had positioned itself as if planning to stay, and something about that simple act of companionship cracked open a space in Declan's heart he'd forgotten existed. "So you probably think I'm pathetic," he continued, surprised by how natural it felt to confide in this small creature. Guy who had everything, throwing it all away on bad bets and worse judgment. My ex-partners would laugh if they could see me now. Declan Morrison, master of the universe, talking to a stray cat in an alley. But even as he said the words, he realized they didn't sting the way they should have. There was something about Kestrel's unwavering presence that made the shame feel less crushing, the failure less final. The wind picked up, sending a newspaper skittering past them like urban tumbleweeds. Declan pulled his thin coat tighter, but Kestrel seemed unaffected, radiating a warmth that defied the December cold. The cat's breathing was steady and peaceful, a counterpoint to the chaos in Declan's mind. "I should go," Declan said eventually, though he made no move to stand. "Find somewhere warmer. You should too, probably. Not safe out here for either of us." But Kestrel had other ideas. When Declan finally gathered the energy to stand, his legs stiff from sitting on cold concrete, the cat rose with him. When he started walking toward the more sheltered doorway of a closed electronics store, Kestrel followed. When he settled down again, trying to find a position that didn't leave every joint aching, the cat immediately curled up against his side. The message was clear. They were together now, for better or worse. As the night deepened and the city's noise faded to the occasional taxi or distant siren, Declan found himself studying his unexpected companion. Kestrel slept with one ear slightly raised, alert even in rest. There were small scars on the cat's face and legs, evidence of a hard life, battles fought and survived. Yet there was nothing defeated about this creature. If anything, Kestrel radiated a quiet confidence, a sense of having found exactly what he'd been looking for. "What do you want from me?" Declan whispered into the darkness. "I've got nothing left to give." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. He'd given up his money, his status, his pride, but he was still breathing, still thinking, still capable of feeling the warmth of a small cat pressed against his ribs. Maybe that was enough for now. Maybe that was everything. The last thing Declan remembered before exhaustion finally claimed him was the rhythm of Kestrel's purr and the strange, impossible thought that perhaps he hadn't found this cat at all. Perhaps, in the way of creatures who understand desperation better than humans ever could, this cat had found him. Declan woke to the sound of Kestrel's claws on concrete, that same deliberate tapping that had marked their first meeting. Tap, tap, tap. 3 precise strikes against the pavement, repeated until Declan's eyes opened fully and focused on the cat sitting primly beside him. The morning light revealed details the darkness had hidden. Kestrel was smaller than he'd seemed in the shadows, probably no more than 8 pounds, but there was nothing fragile about his compact frame. His grey coat held subtle brown undertones that caught the early sunlight, and those amber eyes held an intelligence that made Declan uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. "Morning to you too," Declan mumbled, his back protesting as he sat up against the storefront's glass door. Every part of his body ached from sleeping on concrete, but Kestrel looked perfectly rested, already grooming his paws with methodical precision. The breakfast crowd was beginning to emerge from the nearby subway station, office workers in wool coats, clutching coffee cups and moving with the efficient urgency of people who belong somewhere. Declan had been one of them not long ago, checking his phone every 30 seconds, calculating opportunities and risks with each step. Now he was part of the scenery they hurried past, another piece of urban debris they'd trained themselves not to see. But Kestrel seemed oblivious to social hierarchies. When a woman in an expensive pantsuit dropped her Metro card near their makeshift sleeping spot, the cat immediately pounced on the plastic rectangle and carried it directly to her feet. She looked down in surprise, smiled despite herself, and murmured thank you before hurrying on. The interaction was brief, but it left Declan with an odd sense of pride. "Show off," he told Kestrel, who returned to his side with what looked remarkably like smugness. The day's first real test came when Declan's stomach began its familiar cramping routine. The soup kitchen on 18th Street wouldn't open until 11, but there was a bagel shop on the corner where he'd seen employees throwing away day-old pastries. The arithmetic of desperation had taught him to time these small opportunities carefully. As he approached the shop's rear entrance, Kestrel followed close behind. The cat seemed to understand the purpose of their mission, staying quiet and alert as Declan waited for the right moment to approach the dumpster. But when the shop's back door opened and a young employee emerged with a bag of discarded food, Declan felt his courage fail. This was the part he still couldn't accept, the moment when survival required him to cross lines his former self would have found unthinkable. His pride, already battered, rebelled against the idea of scavenging like some urban animal. He started to turn away, prepared to endure the hunger rather than endure the shame. That's when Kestrel acted. The cat walked directly to the employee, a girl who couldn't have been more than 19 with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, and sat down at her feet. Then, with theatrical precision, Kestrel performed his 3-tap ritual against the pavement. Tap, tap, tap. He looked up at the girl expectantly, as if this were a perfectly normal form of communication. "Oh my God, are you adorable?" the girl said, crouching down to pet Kestrel. "Are you hungry, little guy?" Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. She glanced around, noticed Declan standing awkwardly nearby, and made the connection immediately. There was no judgment in her expression, only the practical kindness of someone who'd grown up in the city and understood its harsh equations. "We've got day-old everything bagels," she said to Declan, her voice matter-of-fact rather than pitying. "Store policy says we have to throw them out, but they're perfectly good. You want a couple?" Declan's throat was too tight to speak, so he nodded. The girl, her name tag read Sophie, handed him a bag containing 4 bagels and a small container of cream cheese. "There's a water spigot around the side if you need it," she added. And she looked down at Kestrel, who was now purring loudly enough to be heard over the street traffic. "Does he eat regular cat food?" "I've got a can in my backpack. My roommate's cat is super picky, so I always carry extras." This time Declan found his voice. That's very kind of you, thank you." Sophie opened the can and placed it on the ground. Kestrel approached it with dignity, sniffed once, and began eating with small, careful bites. But after consuming about a third of the food, he stopped and sat back. He looked at Declan, then at the bagels, then performed his 3-tap routine again. The message was unmistakable. "If I eat, you eat too." "He's training you," Sophie observed with amusement. "My roommate's cat does the same thing. Won't touch his food until she sits down with her own plate. Cats are big on fairness." As if to prove her point, Kestrel refused to continue eating until Declan opened one of the bagels and took a bite. Only then did the cat return to his meal, purring contentedly as they shared their first proper breakfast together. After Sophie returned to work, Declan and Kestrel found a small park where they could eat in relative peace. The bagel was day-old but still good, and the cream cheese felt like luxury after days of vending machine snacks and soup kitchen fare. More importantly, the 3-tap ritual had created something between them. A protocol, a shared understanding that neither would eat unless both could eat. "Is this how it works?" Declan asked Kestrel, who was methodically cleaning his whiskers after finishing his portion of the cat food. "You take care of me, I take care of you?" But even as he said it, Declan knew the arrangement wasn't that simple. Kestrel had initiated their encounter at the bagel shop, had somehow orchestrated Sophie's kindness in a way that preserved Declan's dignity while meeting their practical needs. The cat wasn't just accepting care, he was actively engineering their survival. Over the following days, the pattern repeated with variations. Kestrel would lead Declan to opportunities he would have missed or been too proud to pursue on his own. A construction worker eating lunch alone who didn't mind sharing his sandwich with the guy with the smart cat. A church volunteer who mentioned that they served meals on Tuesday evenings, no questions asked. A librarian who didn't enforce the no animals policy as long as Kestrel stayed quiet and didn't bother other patrons. Each interaction followed the same basic structure. Kestrel would approach with his characteristic confidence, win someone over with his obvious intelligence and gentle demeanor, and somehow communicate that he and Declan were a package deal. People responded to the cat in ways they never would have responded to Declan alone. A homeless man was invisible, threatening, or pitiable, but a homeless man with a remarkable cat was interesting, even endearing. The nights were still brutal. The temperature had dropped consistently below freezing, and the shelter situation remained impossible. No pets, no exceptions, was the universal rule, and Declan had stopped asking. He'd found a loading dock behind a 24-hour laundromat, where the industrial dryers created enough ambient heat to make sleeping bearable, but barely. It was during one of these long, cold nights that Declan first spoke honestly to Kestrel about his fears. "I don't know how long I can do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The cat was pressed against his chest, a warm weight that made breathing easier and thoughts clearer. Not the cold or the hunger. I mean, those are terrible, but they're just physical. It's the disappearing. You know? Each day I feel a little less like the person I used to be, a little more like someone who doesn't exist. Kestrel's purr intensified, vibrating against Declan's ribs like a small engine of comfort. Before this, I thought I knew who I was. Declan Morrison, master of the universe. Big deals, bigger ego, biggest mistakes. But now, I look in windows sometimes, catch my reflection, and I don't recognize the guy looking back. What if I can't find my way back to being someone who matters? The cat shifted position, placing one small paw directly over Declan's heart. The gesture was so deliberate, so precisely placed, that it felt like an answer. "You matter right now. You matter to me." "You're probably right," Declan said, surprised by how much the simple contact helped. "Maybe I'm overthinking this. Maybe the only thing that matters is making it through tonight, then tomorrow night, then the one after that. Is that how you do it? One day at a time?" Kestrel's response was to begin his evening grooming routine, licking his paws and washing behind his ears with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. There was something deeply reassuring about watching this small creature maintain his dignity and routines, despite their harsh circumstances. If Kestrel could find ways to thrive in this situation, maybe Declan could learn to do the same. As the night deepened, and the sounds of the city faded to their familiar urban lullaby of distant traffic and humming machinery, Declan found himself making a promise to the small weight pressed against his chest. "I'll try," he said quietly. "I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'll try to be worth the trouble you're taking with me. Deal?" Kestrel's purr was answer enough. But as sleep finally began to claim him, Declan couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important about their arrangement. Kestrel's behavior was too purposeful, too strategic to be simple animal instinct. The cat was planning something, orchestrating something, with a patience and intelligence that made Declan wonder who was really taking care of whom. The coffee shop wasn't much to look at, a narrow storefront wedged between a dry cleaner and a discount cell phone repair shop on East 28th Street. Maribel's was painted in fading blue letters across the window, and the interior held maybe a dozen mismatched tables and chairs that had seen better decades. But it was warm, the coffee smelled real, and most importantly, Kestrel had planted himself directly in front of the door at 6:30 in the morning and refused to move. "Come on," Declan had coaxed, pulling gently at the cat's scruff. "There's a McDonald's 2 blocks down, better chance of getting something there." But Kestrel had simply sat down more firmly, wrapped his tail around his front paws, and fixed Declan with that amber stare that had become impossible to argue with. After 20 minutes of standoff, during which early commuters stepped carefully around them, the front door of the coffee shop opened. The woman who emerged was somewhere in her 50s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of decades of hard work. She wore a stained apron over jeans and a flannel shirt, and her first reaction to finding a man and a cat camped outside her door was to sigh deeply. "You can't sleep here," she said, but her tone held more resignation than hostility. "Health department, you know. I've got a business to run." "We weren't sleeping," Declan said quickly. "Just waiting. My cat seems to think this place is important." The woman, Maribel presumably, looked down at Kestrel, who immediately stood and performed his 3-tap greeting against the sidewalk. Her expression shifted from irritation to curiosity. "He's well behaved," she observed. "Most strays around here are half feral. This one's got manners." "He's unusual," Declan agreed, not mentioning that Kestrel had trained him more than he'd trained Kestrel. Maribel studied them both for a moment, taking in Declan's rumpled appearance and the obvious bond between man and cat. She seemed to be calculating something, weighing options in the way of someone who'd learned to make quick decisions about people. "I need help opening up," she said finally. "Got to get the coffee going, chairs down, register ready before the breakfast rush. You any good with your hands?" Declan started to give his standard response about his business background, then caught himself. Nobody cared about his MBA or his deal-making experience. I can follow directions. Good enough. Cat stays outside, though. Health department, she repeated, but her tone suggested negotiation was possible. What followed was the strangest job interview of Declan's life. Maribel put him to work immediately, lifting chairs off tables, grinding coffee beans, learning the ancient cash register that required a PhD in mechanical engineering to operate. She watched him work without comment, occasionally barking instructions or corrections. Kestrel watched from outside the window, positioned so he could see both Declan and the street. Whenever Declan looked up from his tasks, the cat was there, alert and attentive, like a supervisor monitoring a particularly important project. The breakfast crowd was modest but steady. Construction workers grabbing coffee and donuts before heading to job sites, office workers who preferred Maribel's bitter brew to Starbucks, elderly regulars who came as much for conversation as caffeine. Declan found himself remembering skills he'd forgotten he had: customer service from his first job in college, basic math from before calculators did everything, the simple satisfaction of completing tasks that had immediate, visible results. "You're not from around here," Maribel observed during a brief lull, refilling the industrial-sized coffee pot with movements born of decades of repetition. "No," Declan said carefully. "Different neighborhood, different life, really." "Figured. You handle money like someone who's used to having it, but you work like someone who needs it. What happened?" The directness of the question caught Declan off guard. He'd grown accustomed to the careful blindness of strangers, the way people avoided eye contact, avoided questions, avoided acknowledgement of uncomfortable realities. Maribel's matter-of-fact curiosity was harder to deflect. "Bad investments," he said finally. "Thought I was smarter than I was." "Market get you?" "Among other things." Maribel nodded, unsurprised. "Happens to a lot of guys, usually the ones who think they've got it all figured out." She glanced out at Kestrel, who was now attracting attention from passing pedestrians. A small girl had stopped to pet him while her mother waited patiently, and the cat was allowing the attention with regal grace. "That cat of yours is good for business," Maribel continued. "People like animals. Makes them feel good, want to stick around, buy an extra pastry." It was true. Over the course of the morning, Declan had noticed how customers' expressions softened when they saw Kestrel through the window. Several had lingered longer than necessary, and a few had asked about him specifically. "He's got personality," Declan agreed. "He's got sense," Maribel corrected. "Knows quality when he sees it. This place isn't much to look at, but the coffee's good, and the prices are fair." Cat's got taste. The lunch rush was lighter but required different skills. Heating up pre-made sandwiches, making change quickly, keeping track of multiple orders without writing anything down. Declan surprised himself by adapting to the rhythm, finding efficiency in simplicity after years of managing complex financial instruments. During the afternoon lull, Maribel disappeared into her small office behind the counter, leaving Declan to handle the few remaining customers. An elderly man wanted to know about the distinguished gentleman outside. Kestrel had found a sunny patch near the window and was displaying his best profile for passers-by. A teenage girl asked if the cat was friendly, then spent 10 minutes crouched on the sidewalk, scratching behind his ears while he purred loudly enough to be heard through the glass. When Maribel returned, she was carrying a small bowl of water and what looked like pieces of leftover sandwich meat. "Health department doesn't say anything about feeding cats outside," she said, setting the bowl near the door. "And that meat's going bad anyway." Kestrel approached the offering with his usual dignity, sniffed once, then looked through the window directly at Declan. The message was clear. He wouldn't eat until Declan ate too. "Stubborn," Maribel observed. "Won't take charity. I like that in a cat." She looked at Declan thoughtfully. "You eaten today?" "I—" Declan started to deflect, but Maribel was already moving toward the small refrigerator behind the counter. "Got leftover turkey sandwich. Customer ordered it, then changed her mind. Can't sell it now. Might as well not waste it." She handed him the sandwich wrapped in deli paper, and only then did Kestrel begin eating from the bowl outside. The coordination was so obvious that Maribel laughed despite herself. "Never seen anything like that," she said. "Cat's got you trained better than my ex-husband." As the day wound toward evening, Maribel began her closing routine. Declan helped without being asked, wiping down tables, stacking chairs, counting the register. The work was simple, but satisfying in ways his previous career had never been. Each task had a clear beginning and end, a visible result, an immediate purpose. "You can come back tomorrow," Maribel said as she locked the front door. 6:30, same as today. "Can't pay much, minimum wage, tips if there are any. Free meal at lunch, take it or leave it." Declan looked through the glass at Kestrel, who was sitting patiently by the door, waiting for the next phase of whatever plan he'd been executing since their first meeting. "I'll take it," Declan said. "Good." Maribel paused, keys in hand. "Cat can stay outside during business hours, long as he doesn't cause problems. Seems to me he's the opposite of problems." As they walked away from Maribel's, Kestrel trotting contentedly beside him, Declan felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the anticipation of tomorrow. Not the dread of surviving another day, but the actual desire to return to a place where he was needed, useful, part of something larger than his own failures. "How did you know?" he asked Kestrel as they settled into their usual spot behind the laundromat. "About the job, about Maribel, about all of it?" Kestrel's answer was to curl up against Declan's side and begin purring, but there was something almost smug in the sound. The cat had orchestrated the entire day, from choosing the coffee shop to timing their arrival to managing the complex social dynamics that had resulted in employment. For the first time since their partnership began, Declan wondered if he was giving Kestrel enough credit. This wasn't just an intelligent animal looking for survival. This was a creature with a plan, executing it with remarkable precision and patience. But as sleep began to claim him, warmed by the knowledge that tomorrow held purpose and possibility, Declan decided he didn't need to understand Kestrel's methods. He just needed to trust them. The last thing he heard before drifting off was the 3-tap rhythm against the concrete, fainter now, but still deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. A reminder, a promise, a signal that their work together was just beginning. 3 weeks into his employment at Maribel's, Declan had developed something resembling a routine. Up before dawn, quick wash at the public restroom in the nearby park, 20 minutes of shared breakfast with Kestrel from whatever Sophie at the bagel shop had saved for them. Then the walk to the coffee shop, where Kestrel would take up his self-appointed post by the window, while Declan ground beans, set up chairs, and prepared for another day of serving coffee to people who had regular lives and permanent addresses. The work was harder than anything he'd done in his previous life, but it was also strangely satisfying. His hands, once soft from years of desk work, had developed calluses from lifting boxes and operating the temperamental espresso machine. His back ached constantly from bending over tables and reaching for supplies, but his mind felt clearer than it had in years. There was something to be said for work that had immediate, visible results: a clean table, a satisfied customer, a properly made cappuccino. Kestrel had become the unofficial mascot of the establishment. Regular customers asked about him by name. Children pressed their faces to the window to watch him groom himself in the morning sunlight, and even the most hurried commuters found themselves slowing down when they passed his corner. Maribel had started keeping a small jar by the register labeled Kestrel's Treat Fund, and it was surprising how many people dropped in change after their morning coffee. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to cover Kestrel's food and the occasional veterinary need. More importantly, it represented something Declan had lost somewhere along his fall from grace: the ability to care for something other than himself. Every dollar that went into that jar was proof that he could still be trusted with responsibility, still be part of something that mattered to other people. The test came on a grey Thursday morning in February, when the breakfast rush was in full swing, and Declan was juggling 3 orders, while the ancient espresso machine made sounds like a dying spacecraft. He looked up to see a familiar face in the doorway: Richard Kellerman, one of his former partners from the hedge fund, impeccably dressed in a camel haircoat that probably cost more than Declan made in 2 months. Richard's eyes swept the small coffee shop with the kind of casual disdain that rich men reserved for places they'd never need to frequent. When his gaze landed on Declan behind the counter, wearing a stained apron and wielding a coffee pot, his expression shifted from disdain to something worse: pity mixed with cruel amusement. "Well," Richard said loudly enough for other customers to hear, "look what we have here. Declan Morrison, master of the universe, reduced to this." The conversation in the coffee shop didn't stop exactly, but it shifted, people continuing to talk while obviously listening, pretending not to notice the drama unfolding at the counter. Declan felt his face flush hot. the familiar combination of shame and rage that had become his constant companion during the worst days of his fall. "Richard," he said evenly, continuing to work the espresso machine. "Coffee? God, no. I was just walking by, saw you through the window, had to see if it was really you. The mighty Declan Morrison, serving coffee to—" Richard glanced around dismissively. "Well, to people like this." Through the window, Declan could see Kestrel, alert and watching. The cat's posture was different than usual, tense, protective, as if he could sense the hostility radiating from Richard, even through the glass. "It's honest work," Declan said, finishing the cappuccino and handing it to its owner, an elderly woman who was pretending to read her newspaper while obviously absorbing every word of the confrontation. "Honest work," Richard repeated, laughing. "Jesus, Declan, listen to yourself. You used to move more money in a single day than this place makes in a year. Remember the Hastings acquisition? You called it your masterpiece." Declan remembered. It had been a hostile takeover of a family-owned manufacturing company, executed with surgical precision and absolutely no consideration for the 300 employees who lost their jobs when the new owners moved operations overseas. At the time, he'd been proud of the ruthless efficiency. Now, surrounded by working people who treated each other with basic decency, the memory felt toxic. "Things change," Declan said. "They certainly do." Richard pulled out his phone, and Declan realized with horror that he was taking pictures. "Wait until the boys see this. Declan Morrison, barista to the masses. They'll die laughing." The humiliation was complete and public. Declan could feel the eyes of every customer in the shop, could imagine the story spreading through his former social circles, could picture himself becoming the cautionary tale that ambitious young financiers told each other about what happened when you got too cocky, made too many enemies, fell too far. The old Declan would have exploded, would have grabbed Richard by his expensive lapels and thrown him out onto the street, consequences be damned, would have quit on the spot rather than endure another second of public shame. Instead, he looked through the window at Kestrel. The cat was sitting perfectly still, but his amber eyes were fixed on Declan with an intensity that seemed to burn through the glass. Not judgment, not pity, but something else. A reminder of all the mornings they'd shared breakfast, all the nights they'd kept each other warm, all the small victories they'd achieved together. Kestrel had never cared about Declan's past success or current failure. He cared about whether Declan showed up, whether he did the work, whether he could be counted on when it mattered. "You done?" Declan asked Richard quietly. "Oh, I'm just getting started. You have no idea how many people are going to want to hear about this. The great Declan Morrison, fallen so low, he's—" "Customer," Declan interrupted, nodding toward the line that had formed behind Richard. "You're holding up paying customers." Richard turned to see a construction worker in work boots and a hard hat, clearly impatient to get his coffee and get to his job site. Behind him stood a nurse in scrubs, who'd obviously just finished a night shift, and behind her a young mother with a baby carrier, all of them representing the kind of people Richard would normally never notice, let alone consider important enough to defer to. "These people aren't—" Richard started, then stopped as he realized how that sentence would sound in a room full of "these people." "They're customers," Declan said firmly. "They're here for coffee, not a show. So either order something or get out of the way." For a moment, Richard looked like he might push the confrontation further, but something in Declan's tone, calm, final, backed by the quiet authority of a man who'd found his footing in an unexpected place, seemed to deflate his theatrics. "This isn't over," Richard said, but he was already backing toward the door. "I'll make sure everyone knows where the mighty Declan Morrison ended up." "I'm sure you will," Declan replied, already turning his attention to the construction worker. "What can I get you?" The rest of the morning passed in a blur of ordinary transactions, but Declan was hyper-aware of the glances from other customers, the whispered conversations, the way people seemed to be studying him with new interest. By lunchtime, when the crowds thinned and Maribel emerged from her office, he was convinced his brief employment was over. "Heard you had some excitement this morning," Maribel said, wiping down the counter with practiced efficiency. "You could call it that," Declan replied, bracing himself for the conversation he'd been dreading all morning. "Look, Maribel, I understand if you need to let me go. Having that kind of drama in your place isn't good for business." Maribel paused in her cleaning, studying his face with the same direct gaze she'd used during his impromptu job interview 3 weeks earlier. "What kind of drama?" she asked. You mean some entitled jackass coming in here, disrupting my customers, and acting like he owns the place? He's someone I used to work with. Before all this, he wanted to make sure everyone knew how far I'd fallen. And? And what? And how far have you fallen? Maribel's tone was genuinely curious, not mocking. You show up every day on time. You work hard, treat customers with respect, learn fast, don't steal from the register or show up drunk or high like the last 3 people I hired. Your cat brings in business and makes people smile. Where exactly is the falling in all that? Through the window, Declan could see Kestrel in his usual afternoon position, stretched out in a patch of sunlight that had found its way between the surrounding buildings. A small girl was crouched beside him, giggling as he allowed her to pet his head, while her grandmother waited patiently with a cup of coffee. He made it sound like serving coffee was beneath me, I guess. Ah, Maribel's expression clarified. One of those. Probably never worked a real job in his life, right? Never had to worry about making rent or choosing between groceries and medicine? Something like that. Let me tell you something, Declan. I've been running this place for 12 years. I've seen every kind of person there is come through that door. Rich ones, poor ones, smart ones, stupid ones, mean ones, kind ones. You know what I've learned? The measure of a person isn't what they used to be, or what they might become someday. It's what they do right now, today, when nobody's watching and nobody's keeping score. She gestured toward the window. That cat of yours? He's got the right idea. Doesn't care what you used to do for work or how much money you had or what kind of car you drove. Cares whether you feed him, whether you show up when you say you will, whether you stick around when things get tough. That's real loyalty, and it's earned. The lunch crowd began to trickle in, and their conversation was interrupted by the familiar rhythm of orders and service, but something had shifted in the dynamic between them. Where before Maribel had been cautiously optimistic about her newest employee, now she seemed actively protective of him. It showed in small ways throughout the afternoon. When a customer made a joke about the help while Declan was cleaning tables, Maribel materialized beside him with the kind of smile that could cut glass. Declan here is learning the business, she said sweetly, thinking about opening his own place eventually. Always smart to start from the ground up, don't you think? Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. The customer backpedaled quickly, suddenly interested in his newspaper. Later, when Declan was restocking supplies in the small storage room, he overheard Maribel talking to Mrs. Chen, one of her long-time regulars. That young man of yours seems to be working out well, Mrs. Chen observed. He's got potential, Maribel replied. Smart, reliable, good with people. Plus that cat of his is better advertising than anything I could pay for. He seems different from your usual hires. He is. Life knocked him down hard, but he's getting back up. Takes character to start over from nothing and not complain about it. Declan found himself unexpectedly moved by the casual defense. In his previous life, praise had always felt calculated, part of the complex social and professional chess game that governed high-finance relationships. Maribel's words weren't meant to advance any agenda. They were simply true. The evening brought its own challenges. Richard's visit had shaken something loose in Declan's carefully constructed new equilibrium. As he and Kestrel made their way to their usual sleeping spot behind the laundromat, he found himself replaying the confrontation, imagining all the ways he could have handled it better. I should have thrown him out, he told Kestrel as they settled in for the night. The old me would have made him leave before he could finish his little performance. Kestrel, who was conducting his nightly grooming ritual, paused to look at him with those unsettling amber eyes. Or maybe I should have owned it. Told him exactly what I thought about our old life, about what really matters. Made some grand speech about dignity and honest work and finding yourself. The cat resumed his grooming, seemingly unimpressed by either alternative. But that would have been about me, wouldn't it? About my pride, my ego, my need to win, just like the old days. Declan was quiet for a moment, thinking. You know what actually happened? I did my job. Served the customers, kept the business running, didn't let one asshole ruin everyone else's morning. That's what Maribel needed from me. So that's what I did. Kestrel finished his cleaning routine and curled up against Declan's side, purring with what sounded like approval. Think Richard will follow through on his threat? Tell everyone where I ended up? The purring continued, steady and reassuring. Probably doesn't matter. People like that. They move on to the next piece of gossip pretty quickly. And the people whose opinions actually matter. Maribel, the customers who come in every day, Sophie at the bagel shop. They already know who I am now. This version of me, not the one I used to be. As sleep began to claim him, Declan realized that Richard's visit, painful as it had been, had actually clarified something important. The old Declan Morrison was gone, and good riddance. The person who remained might not have much money or status or power, but he had something his former self had never possessed. The respect of people who mattered, earned through actions rather than acquired through connections. It was a different kind of wealth, but it felt more solid, more real than anything he'd accumulated in his previous life. Spring came early to New York that year, and with it, changes that neither Declan nor Kestrel could have anticipated. The first sign was Maribel's announcement on a busy Tuesday morning in March, delivered with the kind of forced casualness that meant she'd been rehearsing the words for weeks. "Got an offer on the place," she said during the afternoon lull, not looking up from the inventory sheets she was pretending to study. "Developer wants to put up condos. Good money, really good money." Declan felt his stomach drop, but he kept his voice steady. "Congratulations, that's great for you." "Yeah." Maribel's tone suggested she felt anything but congratulated. 40 years I've been thinking about retirement. This could be my chance." Through the window, Kestrel was holding court with his usual afternoon admirers. Today it was a group of elementary school kids who'd convinced their mothers to stop for hot chocolate on the way home. The cat had positioned himself so each child could pet him in turn, his purr loud enough to be heard through the glass. "When would you—" Declan started, then stopped. When would he what? Lose his job, return to the streets, start over again with nothing but a cat and whatever meager savings he'd managed to accumulate? "Nothing's decided yet," Maribel said quickly, reading his expression. "These things take time. Permits, inspections, all that bureaucratic nonsense. Could be months before anything happens." But they both knew that months passed quickly, and Declan's life had already proven how rapidly stability could evaporate. The news cast a shadow over the following weeks, even as business continued as usual. Regular customers began asking questions. Had Maribel really sold out to developers? Would the coffee shop be demolished? Where would they get their morning caffeine fix and their daily dose of Kestrel's charm? It was Mrs. Chen who first suggested the community meeting. "We should talk about this," she announced one Thursday morning. Her usual soft-spoken demeanor replaced by something more forceful. "This place matters to people. Maybe there's something we can do." The meeting convened the following Sunday evening after closing time. Declan had expected maybe a dozen people, the most loyal regulars, perhaps a few neighbors who'd heard about the potential closure. Instead, nearly 50 people crowded into the small space, spilling out onto the sidewalk where Kestrel supervised from his perch on a folding chair someone had brought from home. The diversity of the crowd was remarkable. Construction workers sat beside office employees, elderly retirees mixed with young parents, students from the nearby community college stood next to shop owners from up and down the block. What they had in common was their connection to Maribel's and, increasingly, their affection for the grey cat who'd become the unofficial mascot of East 28th Street. "This isn't just about coffee," said Tom, the construction foreman who'd become one of Declan's favorite customers. "This is about having a place where everybody's welcome, where you can sit down and not worry about getting kicked out for not spending enough or taking up too much space. My grandmother comes here every morning," added a young woman Declan recognized but didn't know by name. "She doesn't speak much English, but Maribel always knows what she wants, always makes her feel at home. Where's she going to go if this place closes?" The stories continued for over an hour. Single mothers who appreciated having a safe place to bring their children. Unemployed people who could nurse a single cup of coffee for hours without judgment. Night shift workers who depended on Maribel's early opening hours. Elderly people who relied on the social interaction as much as the caffeine. And repeatedly people mentioned Kestrel, how seeing him brightened their mornings, how their children looked forward to petting him, how his presence somehow made the whole neighborhood feel more friendly and connected. "That cat's got more sense than most humans," observed Miguel, who owned the dry cleaning shop next door. "Knows quality when he sees it, knows community when he finds it. Been watching him for months now. He's not just hanging around for the food. He's part of this place, part of what makes it special." Maribel had remained quiet through most of the meeting, but as the testimonials continued, Declan could see her resolve weakening. This wasn't just a business transaction to her, it was a community institution she'd built over decades, and the prospect of destroying it for financial gain was clearly more complicated than she'd initially thought. "The money would set me up for retirement," she finally said, her voice barely audible over the crowd. "I'm not getting any younger. And this business, it's 7 days a week, 18 hours a day. I'm tired. What if it didn't have to be?" The voice was Declan's, and he was as surprised as anyone to hear himself speaking. "What if we could find a way to keep the place running while giving you the break you need?" The room fell quiet, 50 pairs of eyes turning toward him. A few months ago, the attention would have terrified him. Now, with Kestrel's steady presence visible through the window and the faces of people he'd come to care about surrounding him, he felt oddly calm. "I don't know much about running a coffee shop," he continued, "but I've learned a lot about this one, about the customers, the suppliers, the daily routines, and I know something about business, about numbers and planning and making things work." "You thinking about buying me out?" Maribel asked, not unkindly. Declan laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd managed in months. "With what money?" "No, I'm thinking about something else. A cooperative, maybe. Community ownership. Everyone who uses this place has a stake in keeping it running." The idea had come to him suddenly, but as he spoke, it began to feel not just possible, but inevitable. This was what Kestrel had been teaching him all along, that survival wasn't a solo endeavor, that the strongest foundations were built on mutual support and shared investment. "We pool resources," he continued, warming to the concept. "Regular customers become members, contribute what they can, money, time, expertise. Maribel keeps a stake but doesn't have to carry the whole burden herself. We hire additional help, maybe expand the hours, definitely keep everything that makes this place special." Tom, the construction foreman, leaned forward. "You're talking about a lot of coordination, a lot of trust. How do we know it wouldn't fall apart in 6 months?" Declan looked through the window at Kestrel, who was now surrounded by a small group of children who'd been brought to the meeting by their parents. The cat was allowing each child to pet him in turn, his tail twitching with what looked like amusement as they debated whether he was grey or silver or brown. "Because we've already been doing it," Declan said. "Look around, this room is full of people who showed up on a Sunday night to save a coffee shop and a cat they've never owned. That's not just community, that's investment, emotional, social, practical. We're already stakeholders. We just need to make it official." The discussion that followed was complex, sometimes heated, but ultimately productive. Mrs. Chen volunteered to research the legal requirements for forming a cooperative. Miguel offered to contribute renovation expertise. Sophie from the bagel shop suggested coordinating schedules to avoid competition while supporting each other's businesses. By the time the meeting broke up near midnight, they had the framework for a plan. It would take months to implement, require compromises from everyone involved, and demand a level of trust and cooperation that most business partnerships never achieved. But it felt possible, even inevitable. As the last participants filtered out onto the street, Maribel approached Declan with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You know this is crazy, right?" she said. 50 people trying to run a coffee shop together? It'll be chaos." "Probably," Declan agreed, "but it'll be our chaos. And besides," he nodded toward Kestrel, who was now weaving between the folding chairs, claiming territory and attention with equal confidence, "we've got good management." Over the following months, the transformation of Maribel's from privately owned business to community cooperative became the most complex project Declan had ever managed, more challenging than any merger or acquisition from his previous life, requiring skills he'd never developed in business school. The legal structure alone took weeks to establish, with input from a volunteer lawyer whose daughter loved visiting Kestrel. The financial arrangements required delicate negotiations between members, with vastly different resources and expectations. The operational changes demanded consensus building among people who'd never worked together and had strong opinions about everything from coffee bean suppliers to furniture arrangement. Through it all, Kestrel maintained his role as unofficial supervisor and morale officer. When tensions ran high during planning meetings, he'd appear in someone's lap, purring loudly enough to interrupt arguments. When members seemed ready to quit over disagreements about scheduling or responsibilities, he'd position himself strategically, demanding attention until the humans remembered what they were really fighting for. The grand reopening took place on a warm Saturday in June. The space looked almost exactly the same. Maribel had insisted that the essential character remain unchanged, but the energy was completely different. Members took turns working shifts alongside the paid staff, children drew pictures for the bulletin board, and everyone seemed to have a sense of ownership that went far beyond simple customer loyalty. Kestrel, now officially designated as Community Relations Manager, on a small plaque by his favorite window, surveyed the celebrations with the satisfaction of a creature whose long-term plan had finally come to fruition. As evening approached and the crowds thinned, Declan found himself cleaning tables alongside Maribel, both of them tired but satisfied by the day's success. "Still think I'm crazy for trusting you with all this?" Maribel asked, gesturing around the bustling space. Declan followed her gaze, taking in the diverse group of people who'd committed time, money, and energy to keeping this small corner of the neighborhood alive and thriving. Near the window, Kestrel was accepting congratulations from his human fan club, graciously allowing photos and pets while maintaining his dignity. "Probably," Declan said, "but if I've learned anything over the past year, it's that the best decisions usually seem a little crazy at first." He looked down at Kestrel, who chose that moment to perform his signature 3-tap ritual against the floor. Tap, tap, tap. The same rhythm that had marked their first meeting in a cold alley, that had become their private signal for shared meals and mutual survival, that had evolved into something like a benediction over their unlikely partnership. "What's he doing?" Maribel asked, watching the performance with amusement. "Reminding me that we're in this together," Declan replied. "All of us, for better or worse." As the last customers filtered out and the evening cleaning began, Declan reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a man who measured success in dollars and deals, who believed that strength meant independence and vulnerability meant failure. Now he was part owner of a small coffee shop, living in a modest apartment above the dry cleaner next door, with a cat who'd somehow orchestrated his entire transformation. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life that had chosen him. Or perhaps more accurately, the life that Kestrel had chosen for both of them. And as he watched his unlikely business partner grooming himself in preparation for another night of supervising their small corner of the world, Declan realized that sometimes the most important partnerships were the ones you never saw coming. The penthouse view had shown him the city spread out below, like a possession to be acquired. This view, from ground level, surrounded by neighbors and friends, and the steady presence of a grey cat who'd refused to let him give up, showed him something far more valuable, a place where he belonged, work that mattered, and the understanding that real wealth wasn't something you accumulated alone. It was something you built together, one day at a time, with patience and trust and the occasional 3-tap reminder that nobody succeeds completely on their own.